Why did we stop growing these vegetables? Imagine walking slowly through a medieval village just before sunrise. The air is cool, and the ground is damp beneath your feet. A thin mist rests over the fields. Somewhere nearby, a rooster calls from behind a wooden house, and from inside another home comes the quiet sound of someone stirring a pot over a small fire. There are no supermarkets here. There are no shelves filled with vegetables from distant countries. There is no truck arriving in the morning with crates of produce. Instead, food is close to the soil. It grows in gardens, small fields, orchards, riverbanks, marshes, and patches of land beside cottages. And among those plants are vegetables that would look unfamiliar to many people today. Some were once useful and ordinary. Some were valued because they could survive cold weather. Some provided food during the months when fresh greens were scarce. Others were grown because they were dependable, even when harvests were uncertain. Over centuries, many of these plants became less common. Some disappeared from ordinary gardens. Some survived only in particular regions. And some remained in seed collections, historical gardens, or the memories of gardeners who still knew their names. Tonight, we will move quietly through that older landscape. We will not imagine medieval people as living in a world without vegetables. They had many, but the vegetables they knew were not always the vegetables we know. Their gardens followed different seasons. Their tastes were different. Their methods of cooking were different. And plants that once seemed completely ordinary could slowly become forgotten as agriculture changed. So picture yourself standing beside a medieval kitchen garden. The morning is beginning. The leaves are wet with dew. A wooden fence separates the garden from a narrow path. Inside are rows of plants. There are onions, leeks, cabbages, peas, beans, herbs, turnips, carrots, though not always in the familiar orange form we know today. And among them are plants whose names sound almost strange to modern ears. Skirret, Alexander's, Auroch, Good King Henry, sea kale. These names belong to a quieter chapter in the history of food. To understand why they faded, we first need to understand the world in which they grew. The medieval kitchen garden was not simply a place where someone planted food because they liked gardening. It was part of a household's survival. A small garden could provide onions for a stew, herbs for flavor, greens for a pottage, and roots that could be stored after the harvest. The garden was close to the house because closeness mattered. When the weather was cold, nobody wanted to walk a long distance simply to gather a handful of herbs. When rain covered the paths, the kitchen garden remained within reach. When summer arrived, the garden became a place of constant activity. Leaves were gathered. Roots were pulled from the earth. Beans were shelled. Herbs were cut. Seeds were saved. And nothing was wasted easily. A plant that could provide food at several times of the year had real value. This is one reason some forgotten vegetables were once important. They did not need to be beautiful. They did not need to be large. They only needed to be useful. One of the most interesting examples is skirret. The name itself sounds almost forgotten. Skirret is a root vegetable belonging to the same broad botanical family as carrots and parsley. Its roots are small, pale, and divided into several slender sections. They do not have the smooth appearance of a modern carrot. Instead, they can look somewhat irregular, almost like a collection of pale roots gathered together beneath one plant. But appearances were not the main concern of medieval gardeners. Skiret was valued for its sweetness. The roots contain more natural sweetness than many other traditional root vegetables. For people living before the widespread cultivation of modern sugar crops, and before refined sugar became an everyday ingredient, naturally sweet foods had a particular appeal. Imagine pulling a skiret from dark soil on a cool afternoon. You brush away the earth with your fingers. The roots are pale beneath the dirt. They can be washed, peeled, and cooked. A medieval cook might boil them or prepare them in other simple ways. The result would be very different from the vegetables usually found in a modern kitchen, but it would not necessarily be unpleasant. In fact, sweetness could make a humble root especially welcome. And this was important because medieval cooking did not divide food into the same categories that modern people often use. A dish could combine sweet and savory flavors. Meat could be cooked with fruit. Vegetables could be prepared with spices. A pottage might contain several ingredients gathered from different parts of the household's food supply. The idea of one vegetable belonging only to one kind of dish was not always so strict. Skiret fitted comfortably into this world. It was a useful root. It could grow in cooler climates. It could remain in the ground until needed. And it belonged to a group of crops that made sense in a household where storage was essential. Yet skiret did not remain a major vegetable forever. Over time, other root crops became more popular. Agricultural practices changed, food preferences changed, new varieties became available, and vegetables that were easier to harvest, transport, select, or sell could gradually replace older ones. This is one of the quiet ways food history happens. A plant does not necessarily disappear because people suddenly decide they hate it. Sometimes it simply becomes less convenient. A farmer grows something else because the other crop produces better yields. A market prefers a more uniform vegetable. A cook finds another ingredient easier to prepare. A new crop becomes fashionable. A seed variety becomes more reliable. And little by little, an old plant becomes unusual. The change can take generations. Nobody standing in the garden notices that history is happening. One generation plants skiret. The next plants less of it. Another generation grows it only occasionally. Eventually, the name itself becomes unfamiliar. The garden has changed without any dramatic moment. As the morning slowly arrives in our imagined medieval village, we can move toward another plant. This one is quite different. It is called Alexander's. Alexander's was once a familiar plant in parts of Europe. Its scientific name is Smyrnium olusatrum. It belongs to the parsley family, along with many plants that remain familiar today. It was particularly associated with coastal and southern regions of Europe, and it could grow in places where the climate suited it. The plant has a strong character. Its leaves are dark green. Its stems can become tall. Its roots, leaves, and young shoots have all been used as food. The flavor is stronger than the mild vegetables that dominate many modern kitchens. There is a reason plants like Alexander's could be useful in medieval cooking. Before the modern system of year-round vegetable supply, seasonal gaps mattered. A plant that appeared early in the year could be valuable. The months after winter could be difficult. Stored roots were becoming tired. Fresh greens were beginning to appear, but not everything had returned to the fields. A hardy plant could help bridge that gap. Imagine a medieval household approaching the end of winter. The fire is burning low. The stores of grain are still important. Some onions remain. Perhaps there are dried peas. Perhaps salted food hangs nearby. And outside, the first signs of spring are beginning. A green plant emerging from the soil can seem like more than decoration. It is food. It is freshness. It is a sign that another growing season has begun. Alexander's could occupy that early season space. But like many traditional plants, its flavor was not always gentle. It can be aromatic. It can be somewhat bitter. And modern tastes have often moved toward vegetables that are mild, consistent, and easy to prepare. This difference in taste matters more than it might first appear. Food history is partly the history of what people decide is pleasant. A vegetable can be nutritious and useful, and still lose its place if people stop enjoying its flavor. Over time, stronger tasting plants may be replaced by milder varieties. The change may happen gradually, through gardens and kitchens, rather than through any formal decision. The same pattern can be seen with another old leafy vegetable. Orac. Orac belongs to the genus Atriplex and is related to spinach and chard. It has been cultivated as a leafy food for centuries. In different places and periods, people used it in ways similar to other cooked greens. Its leaves could be gathered while young. They could be cooked and added to meals. The plant could grow in conditions where other vegetables were not always ideal, and it offered something simple but important: leaves. Fresh green leaves. That may sound ordinary now, but imagine a winter landscape before modern refrigeration. The fields are quiet. The trees are bare. The vegetable garden has little visible life. Stored vegetables are the main resource. Dried peas and beans can be kept for long periods. Grain is safely stored. But fresh green food is limited. When spring comes, the appearance of edible leaves becomes meaningful. The first greens can be gathered before many other crops are ready. This made leafy plants important in traditional food systems. Orac was not necessarily the most famous vegetable of its age. It did not need to be. A household did not require every plant to become famous. It only needed some plants to perform their jobs reliably. This is something easy to forget when looking backward. Modern food culture is filled with named varieties. We see photographs of perfect vegetables. We compare colors and shapes. We read labels. We choose between dozens of kinds of tomatoes, lettuce, peppers, and potatoes. A medieval gardener was working with a different system. The garden was not a supermarket. It was an ecosystem of useful plants. Some were grown for roots, some for leaves, some for seeds, some for flavor, some for medicine, some for animal feed, some for more than one purpose. And sometimes the boundaries between these uses were not as clear as they are today. One plant could be eaten at one stage of its growth and used differently at another. This made knowledge extremely important. A gardener needed to know when a plant was ready. A cook needed to know which part was useful. And households often depended on experience passed from one generation to another. That knowledge could be lost. Not all knowledge was written down. Even when medieval manuscripts recorded plants, those records represented only a fraction of everyday experience. Many people who knew how to grow and prepare particular plants left no written account. Their knowledge existed in practice. It was remembered by doing. And when a plant stopped being grown, the practical knowledge around it could disappear as well. This is one reason forgotten vegetables are more than a list of unusual foods. They are traces of older habits. They tell us something about climate, agriculture, taste, storage, labor, and the relationship between households and the soil. Consider Good King Henry. Despite its charming modern English name, the plant is much older than the name itself. It is Chenopodium bonus henricus, a leafy perennial traditionally used as a vegetable in parts of Europe. It was associated with cultivated land and human settlements. Its young leaves and shoots could be eaten. The plant had another useful quality. It was perennial. Unlike an annual crop that must be planted from seed each year, a perennial plant can return repeatedly from the same root system. For a household garden, that could be convenient. A plant that comes back can become part of the landscape. You know where it grows. You know when to expect it. You do not need to begin from the beginning every spring. Picture yourself returning to the same garden after a long winter. The fence is weathered. The soil is dark. The air carries the smell of wet earth. And there, near the edge of the garden, green shoots are appearing again. You recognize them. They were there last year, and the year before that. There is something comforting about a plant that returns. In a world where harvests could fail and weather could change, reliability mattered. Good King Henry could provide edible greens during the growing season. Yet it eventually became much less common as a cultivated vegetable. Again, there was no single moment when the medieval world simply abandoned it. Instead, agriculture became more specialized. Other leafy vegetables became dominant. Spinach, for example, spread widely in Europe and eventually became a familiar part of European cooking. Chard and other greens also had their places. Once a new vegetable became easier to find, easier to grow commercially, or more appealing to consumers, an older plant could quietly retreat. The story of forgotten vegetables is therefore not only a story of loss, it is also a story of replacement. Gardens change because people are always choosing. A farmer chooses the crop that makes sense for the soil. A gardener chooses the plant that survives the weather. A merchant chooses what can be sold. A cook chooses what tastes good. A family chooses what it knows. And over hundreds of years, those choices reshape the landscape. Now imagine walking beyond the garden. The path becomes narrower. The houses grow farther apart. Beyond them is a field. In the distance, perhaps you can see a river, and along damp ground near water, another old food plant could be found. Sea kale. Its name gives away part of its character. It is a wild coastal plant, related to cabbage and other members of the Brassica family. Its natural habitat includes shingle beaches and coastal areas. People have eaten its young shoots and leaves. The plant is hardy and adapted to difficult coastal conditions. Imagine the shore on a cool morning. The wind moves across the water. Salt hangs faintly in the air. There is little shelter. The ground is rough with stones. Yet among this difficult landscape, green shoots appear. A coastal plant does not have the luxury of perfect soil. It must live with wind, salt, and shifting conditions. That resilience made wild food plants valuable. Medieval people did not depend only on carefully cultivated crops. They also gathered from landscapes around them. The boundary between farmed food and wild food could be less rigid than it is for many people today. Hedgerows, woods, wetlands, riverbanks, and coasts all contained edible plants. Knowledge of the landscape could turn an apparently empty place into a source of food. But wild plants required knowledge. You needed to know what was safe. You needed to know which part to gather. You needed to know when it was best. And you needed to understand local conditions. That knowledge could remain strong within communities. But it could also weaken as agricultural systems changed. As food became increasingly available through markets, fewer people needed to identify every edible plant growing around them. The knowledge became less necessary. And what is no longer necessary can slowly be forgotten. There is another vegetable that helps us understand this transition: the medieval carrot. When people hear the word carrot, many imagine a bright orange root. But orange carrots became dominant much later than the earliest cultivated carrots. Historical varieties could be white, yellow, purple, or other colors. The medieval carrot was not simply the modern carrot in a slightly different form. It belonged to a long history of domestication and selection. Carrots were cultivated in Europe during the medieval period, but the varieties available then were different from the forms that later became widespread. The roots could be smaller, they could be more irregular, and their colors could vary. This reminds us that vegetables are not fixed objects. A carrot is not simply a carrot. It is the result of generations of selection. People save seeds from plants they prefer. Perhaps one root is larger. Another tastes sweeter. Another grows better in difficult soil. Another stores longer. Over many generations, these preferences shape the crop. The vegetables we know today are therefore living records of countless choices. The same is true of cabbages. Modern cabbage varieties can look very different from the loose-leaved plants that would have been familiar to medieval gardeners. Kale, cabbage, collards, and related greens belong to a broad family of forms that humans have shaped for different purposes. Some plants were selected for leaves, some for heads, some for stems, some for flowers. The medieval kitchen garden was part of this long experiment. It did not produce vegetables that were primitive in a simple sense. It produced vegetables suited to the needs of the people who grew them, and those needs were shaped by local weather, by soil, by storage, by labor, by available seed, by markets, and by tradition. This becomes especially clear when we think about winter. Winter was not simply a colder version of summer. It changed what could be eaten. A medieval household could not simply walk to a shop and buy fresh vegetables every day. Preservation mattered. Roots could be left in the ground or stored. Cabbages could be preserved in different ways. Legumes could be dried. Grain could remain stored for months. Fruits could be dried. Salt and other preservation methods extended the life of certain foods. A vegetable that survived storage had an advantage. A vegetable that could remain in the ground until needed had another. This helps explain why root vegetables were so important. They could act almost like food waiting underground. Imagine a quiet winter afternoon. Snow may cover the fields in colder regions. The garden looks empty, but beneath the soil, some roots remain. The earth protects them from the worst of the cold. When food is needed, someone can go outside with a basket and a tool. The soil is broken open. A root is pulled free. It is brought into the kitchen. The smell of earth follows it inside. There is no need for a journey across the countryside. No distant supply chain. Just soil, season, and household. Among these traditional roots were parsnips. Parsnips have a long history in European cultivation. They were valued as a root crop and could provide food during the colder part of the year. Their pale roots are naturally sweet, especially after exposure to cold conditions. For a medieval household, this sweetness could be useful. A parsnip could be boiled. It could be incorporated into a pottage. It could be combined with other roots. And it could remain available when the garden offered little else. Yet even parsnips changed over time. Modern varieties have been selected for particular shapes and qualities. The same basic plant has passed through centuries of cultivation. What we see in a modern market is only one chapter of its story. Now consider a vegetable that sounds almost like something from a forgotten herbarium. Rampion. Rampion, Campanula rapunculus, is a bellflower relative whose roots and leaves have been used as food. It was cultivated historically in Europe. The roots could be eaten. The young leaves could also be used. Its appearance is quite different from the vegetables that dominate modern supermarkets. It belongs to a world in which the line between vegetable garden and herb garden was not always sharply drawn. A medieval garden might contain plants that served several purposes: food, flavor, medicine, decoration, and sometimes all of these roles overlapped. A household did not necessarily have a separate mental category for every plant. The useful garden was a collection of resources. The people working there knew the plants by appearance, smell, season, and habit. A modern person might look at a patch of green and see only greenery. A medieval gardener could see dinner. That difference in knowledge is one of the most important things we can carry with us as we travel through this forgotten garden. Food is not only what exists. Food is what people know how to recognize, grow, prepare, and eat. A plant can remain biologically present while disappearing culturally. The seed may still exist. The species may still grow wild. But if fewer people cultivate it, fewer people cook it. And if fewer people cook it, fewer people teach the next generation how to use it. Eventually, the plant becomes obscure. This happened repeatedly. Not always with complete disappearance. Sometimes a forgotten vegetable survived in a village. Sometimes it remained common in one country while disappearing from another. Sometimes it survived as a wild plant. Sometimes gardeners revived it centuries later. And sometimes only its name remained in old texts. The word itself became a small doorway into a vanished garden. As evening approaches in our imagined medieval village, the pace of work begins to slow. The tools are put away. The garden becomes quiet. A pot continues to simmer over the fire. The smell of cooked roots and herbs drifts into the cool air. Inside, people eat without thinking that their vegetables will one day become historical curiosities. For them, These plants are simply food. That may be the most interesting part of all. Forgotten vegetables were not forgotten when they were being eaten. They were ordinary. And ordinary things are often the hardest things for history to preserve. Kings leave records. Battles leave ruins. Churches leave stones. But the vegetable placed into a wooden bowl on an ordinary evening can disappear almost without a trace. The people who ate it rarely imagined that someone centuries later would wonder what it tasted like. They simply ate. And then the bowl was emptied. The fire settled. The garden slept beneath the night sky. Tomorrow someone would return to the soil. There would be more work, more planting, more harvesting, more seeds saved for another year. And among those seeds were the beginnings of a food landscape that would continue changing long after the medieval world had disappeared. So, as the night deepens, we can leave the garden for now. But our journey is not over. There are still other plants waiting in the darker corners of this old landscape. Some grew in monastery gardens. Some appeared beside cottages. Some were gathered from wetlands and woodland edges. Some were grown because they survived neglect. And some disappeared because the vegetables that replaced them were simply easier to grow, easier to sell, or more pleasing to changing tastes. The next time we return to the garden, we will follow the seasons more closely. We will watch what medieval gardeners planted in spring, what they gathered through summer, and what they carefully stored before winter arrived. And slowly, among the familiar onions, cabbages, peas, and beans, the stranger plants will begin to appear again, quietly, almost unnoticed, the way they once did. And beneath the pale morning light of another century, their leaves will unfold once more. The night has passed quietly over the old village. Outside the houses, the fields are dark beneath the last hours before dawn. The air has cooled. A faint breeze moves through the hedges, and somewhere beyond the houses, water passes slowly through a narrow stream. Inside one of the homes, the fire has burned down to a soft bed of embers. Soon, someone will wake. Soon, the garden will begin another day. And when the first light reaches the earth, the plants will look almost unchanged. But each one carries a small history. Some were planted deliberately. Some returned each year. Some were gathered from the wild. Some were valued for their roots. Others for their leaves. And some were useful simply because they appeared early, when the winter stores were becoming less varied. This is where our journey continues. Imagine stepping through the garden gate as morning begins. The wooden latch is cool beneath your hand. The ground is soft from recent rain. The smell of damp soil rises gently as you walk. There are familiar crops here, but among them are plants that would seem unusual to many modern gardeners. One of the most interesting is the humble parsnip. Today, parsnips are still known in Britain and parts of Europe, but they are far less central to everyday diets than they once were. For medieval households, however, root crops could be extremely practical. A root did not spoil as quickly as a delicate leaf. It could remain underground. It could be stored in a cool place. It could be cooked when needed. This mattered in a world without refrigeration. Picture yourself in a medieval kitchen during late autumn. The trees are losing their leaves. The mornings are colder. The garden is becoming quieter. There are fewer fresh greens. but the roots remain. A person carries a basket outside. The soil is broken with a simple tool. A parsnip is lifted from the earth. It is pale and rough. There is still soil clinging to its surface. The root is washed. Then it is brought toward the fire. Perhaps it will become part of a thick pottage. Perhaps it will be boiled. Perhaps it will be combined with other roots. The meal does not need to be complicated. Its value is that the ingredients are available. This was one of the great strengths of medieval food systems. They relied heavily on crops that could survive the passage of time. Grain could be stored. Dried peas could be stored. Beans could be stored. Roots could be stored. And vegetables that could remain in the ground gave households another form of protection against the uncertainty of winter. But parsnips were only one part of this underground world. There was another root whose story takes us toward a very different kind of medieval garden. Skiret. We met skiret earlier, but now we can look more closely at why a plant like this could make sense in an older agricultural system. Skiret has clusters of slender roots. They are not as convenient to clean as the smooth roots of some modern vegetables. Yet they have a naturally sweet flavor. That sweetness was useful. Before sugar became widely affordable, sweetness came from many different sources. Honey was important. Fruit was important. Certain grains could become sweet through processing, and naturally, sweet roots could add another layer of flavor. Skiret was therefore not simply a vegetable, it was a way of bringing sweetness into an otherwise simple meal. Imagine a cook standing near a hearth. The fire gives off a soft warmth. A wooden spoon rests beside a pot. The smell of boiling vegetables fills the room. Among the ingredients are pale roots that have been cleaned and prepared. The cook does not need to think of them as an exotic historical food. They are simply part of the kitchen supply. And that ordinary quality is worth remembering. The medieval world did not know that its vegetables were medieval. They were just vegetables. The category forgotten vegetable exists only because we are looking backward. For the people who grew them, there was nothing mysterious about the plants. Their knowledge was practical. A person knew where to plant them. A person knew when to harvest them. A person knew what part to eat. And perhaps most importantly, a person knew what could replace them when they failed. This last point matters because medieval agriculture was never completely predictable. Weather could change. Rain could arrive too late. Too much rain could damage crops. Cold could last longer than expected. Pests could appear, and poor harvests could affect food prices. This is why diversity could be valuable. A garden containing several kinds of vegetables was not simply attractive, it spread risk. If one crop failed, another might survive. If a summer vegetable suffered from weather, a root crop might still provide food later. If fresh greens disappeared, stored legumes could take their place. A household that knew many plants had more options. This makes the disappearance of traditional vegetables especially interesting. When a plant disappears from cultivation, something more than a flavor can be lost. A small piece of agricultural resilience may also disappear. But we should be careful not to romanticize the past. Medieval people did not grow unusual vegetables because they lived in an idyllic world. They grew what made sense. They worked hard. They dealt with crop failures. They dealt with hunger. They adapted constantly. And when a different crop proved more useful, they often adopted it. This is how food history moves. Slowly, almost invisibly. A new plant enters a garden. At first it is unfamiliar. Someone experiments with it. Another gardener saves its seeds. A market begins to sell it. A cook learns how to prepare it. Children grow up eating it. Eventually, the older plant seems strange. The replacement becomes normal. One of the clearest examples is the turnip. Turnips were widespread in European agriculture and were useful as both human food and animal feed. They could grow relatively quickly. They could produce substantial roots, and their leaves could also be used. Turnips became increasingly important in later agricultural systems, especially as farming practices developed. Their story shows that vegetables were never isolated from wider changes in farming. A plant could rise in importance because farmers discovered new ways to use it. It could become part of crop rotations. It could help feed livestock. And livestock, in turn, could support human communities through meat, milk, hides, manure, and labor. A vegetable was therefore part of a larger system. Imagine standing beside a medieval field. You see a few sheep nearby. There are perhaps cattle in another enclosure. A plow has left lines across the earth. Nothing exists alone. The animals depend on the crops. The crops benefit from the soil. The soil is enriched by animal manure. The household depends on all of them. The garden, field, pasture, and barn form one connected world. This is one reason medieval vegetables cannot be understood simply as recipes. They belong to an agricultural economy. Now let us return to the leafy plants. Because some of the most interesting forgotten vegetables were not roots at all. They were greens. Good King Henry is one example. Its leaves were used as a vegetable, especially when young. The plant is a perennial. It can return year after year. That made it useful around settlements and cultivated areas. There is something appealing about perennial vegetables when we imagine the rhythm of a medieval year. Annual crops require renewed effort. The soil must be prepared. Seeds must be planted. The plants must grow. And if something goes wrong, the whole process may need to begin again. A perennial can feel more settled. It becomes part of the garden. It returns with the seasons. Imagine walking past the same patch year after year. In spring, small green shoots appear. In summer, the plant becomes fuller. In autumn, the garden begins to quiet. Then winter arrives, and beneath the soil, the plant waits. When spring returns, it begins again. This quiet rhythm would have been familiar to generations of gardeners. But even plants that returned reliably could lose their place. A new vegetable could offer more tender leaves. A different crop could grow faster. Another plant could produce a larger harvest. And gradually, Good King Henry became less important. Its decline is a reminder that survival as a species is not the same as survival as a food. A plant can remain alive in the landscape while disappearing from the table. This distinction is important. Many lost vegetables were never truly extinct. They simply became rare. Some continued in small gardens. Some remained in rural areas. Some survived in botanical collections. and some can still be grown today. Their story is therefore not always one of disappearance. Sometimes it is a story of neglect. Now imagine leaving the garden and walking toward the edge of the village. The path passes a stone wall. Moss covers part of the stones. Small plants grow in cracks. Beyond the wall, the land becomes wetter. This is where another kind of food landscape begins. Wetlands were not empty. Marshes, riverbanks, and damp meadows could provide useful plants. Some were gathered rather than cultivated. Others could be encouraged near settlements. Among the edible plants of wet or watery places were species that modern people rarely think of as vegetables. Watercress, for example, has a long history of being gathered and eaten. It grows in flowing or clean water. Its peppery leaves can be eaten fresh or cooked. For someone living near a suitable stream, watercress could be an accessible source of greens. There was no need to sow a field of it. The stream already provided the habitat. A person with local knowledge could recognize where it grew. The same principle applied to many wild foods. The landscape itself was part of the pantry. This does not mean medieval people were constantly wandering through forests searching for food. Most agricultural societies depended heavily on cultivated crops, but wild plants could supplement those crops. They could provide variety. They could fill seasonal gaps. And they could become especially useful when cultivated harvests were poor. Knowledge of wild plants therefore formed part of the practical knowledge of many communities. That knowledge was deeply local. A plant that was common in one region might be rare in another. A coastal community knew its shore. A woodland community knew its forest. A river community knew its wetlands. A household learned the landscape around it. This makes the idea of medieval vegetables complicated. There was no single medieval vegetable list. The plants grown in England were not identical to those grown in France. Those grown in Northern Europe were not the same as those found in Mediterranean regions. Climate mattered. Soil mattered. Trade mattered. Culture mattered. And local tradition mattered. Even within one region, wealthy households and poor households could have different gardens. Monastic communities could cultivate plants that ordinary peasants did not grow. Large estates could maintain specialized gardens. Urban households might rely more heavily on markets. Rural households might depend more on what they could grow themselves. Food history is therefore full of variation. The word medieval covers many centuries. It stretches across a vast part of Europe. It includes different languages, climates, religions, economies, and agricultural traditions. So when we speak of a forgotten vegetable, we should imagine a particular place and season rather than a single universal medieval garden. Let us now imagine a monastery garden. The morning is quiet. Stone buildings surround a courtyard. The air smells faintly of damp stone and vegetation. Beyond the walls, bells may mark the hours. Inside the garden, plants grow in organized spaces. Some are herbs. Some are vegetables. Some have medicinal uses. The gardeners work with care. Monasteries played important roles in preserving agricultural and botanical knowledge, though their gardens varied greatly and should not be imagined as identical everywhere. Written texts could record plants. Seeds could be exchanged. Gardening practices could be passed between communities. But written knowledge was only one part of the story. The gardener still had to work the soil. A manuscript could describe a plant. It could not remove weeds. It could not water a garden. It could not harvest a root. The physical knowledge of gardening remained essential. Among the plants that could appear in such gardens were members of the onion family. Onions and leeks were important vegetables. Garlic was also known. These plants may seem too familiar to belong in a story about forgotten vegetables. But their presence helps us understand something. The medieval garden was not filled only with strange plants. Many familiar vegetables have very old histories. What changed was not always the plant itself. Sometimes the variety changed. Sometimes the way it was grown changed. Sometimes its importance changed. And sometimes a familiar plant remained while its companions disappeared. This is how landscapes slowly become modern. The vegetables we now consider normal are survivors of countless historical changes. We notice them because they remained. We forget the plants that did not. Now let us think about peas. Peas were important in medieval Europe. They could be dried and stored. They could provide protein and energy. They could be grown in many regions. Dried peas were especially valuable because they could survive long periods without spoiling. A bowl of peas could therefore connect summer agriculture with winter food. Imagine harvesting peas in warm weather. The pods are green. The air is filled with insects. The garden smells of leaves and earth. Months later, the same crop may appear in a very different form. The peas have dried. Their bright green color is gone, but their usefulness remains. They can be stored in sacks. When winter arrives, they can be cooked slowly. The household has transformed summer sunlight into winter food. This is the deeper story behind many medieval vegetables. They were not just ingredients. They were part of a system for carrying food through time. A crop that could be dried had one kind of value. A root that could remain underground had another. A cabbage that could be preserved had another. A perennial green had another. The garden was therefore a kind of calendar. Each plant belonged to a moment. Some announced spring. Some filled the summer. Some prepared the household for winter. The gardener was not simply growing food. The gardener was planning for time, and when a plant no longer fit that rhythm, it could become less useful. Perhaps a newer crop stored better. Perhaps a different vegetable grew faster. Perhaps market trade made another ingredient available throughout the year. The rise of markets was especially important. As towns expanded, more people purchased food rather than producing everything themselves. This created opportunities for farmers to specialize. A crop that sold well could be grown in larger quantities. Uniformity became more valuable. Transport became important, and vegetables that worked well in commercial agriculture had advantages over fragile or irregular traditional varieties. This is one reason some old vegetables survived mainly in small gardens. A home gardener could tolerate irregular roots. A commercial farmer might prefer something easier to harvest and sell. A market customer might prefer a familiar appearance. Over time, consumer expectations could shape agriculture. The vegetable itself changed because people changed what they wanted to buy. And what people wanted to buy was influenced by what farmers could produce. It was a slow circle. Farmer Market, cook, consumer, back to farmer. The process could continue for generations. By the time a vegetable became rare, nobody might remember exactly why. There would simply be less of it. And then, perhaps, someone would discover an old reference, a name in a manuscript, a plant in an old garden, a seed in a collection, and suddenly the forgotten vegetable would have a story again. This is part of what makes historical food so fascinating. The past can sometimes be tasted through plants. Not perfectly. We can never recreate an entire medieval meal with absolute certainty. Varieties have changed, soils have changed, cooking methods have changed, and written recipes rarely tell us everything. But growing an old crop can provide a small connection. A root emerges from the soil. A leaf is placed in a pot. A familiar human act repeats itself after centuries. The connection is quiet. It does not require a grand reconstruction. It only requires attention. As the afternoon light begins to fade in our imagined village, the garden becomes calmer. The leaves move gently in the wind. A few insects hover above the plants. The earth has dried slightly under the sun. Someone gathers vegetables for the evening meal. Perhaps there are onions, perhaps a few turnips, perhaps peas, perhaps herbs. And among them, if the household is fortunate, there may be one of the older plants we have been following. A few leaves of good King Henry, some skirret roots, perhaps a wild green gathered nearby. Nothing looks extraordinary. Yet each plant carries centuries of adaptation. Each one reflects choices made by farmers and cooks, and each one tells us something about what people once considered worth growing. The evening meal is prepared. The pot begins to simmer. Steam rises into the cool air. Wood crackles softly. The smell of cooked roots and herbs fills the room. Outside, the garden darkens. The plants disappear into shadow. But beneath the soil, roots remain. Seeds rest. Perennial plants wait. And the garden holds its memory. Tomorrow, the work will begin again. But there is another part of the story we have not yet explored. Some forgotten vegetables were not abandoned because they were difficult to grow. They were pushed aside because the world around them changed. New crops arrived. New tastes developed. New agricultural systems demanded different plants. And perhaps the greatest change came from beyond the medieval world itself. Plants traveled. Seeds crossed borders. Foods from distant lands slowly entered European agriculture. Some became revolutionary. Others remained minor. And over the centuries, the arrival of new crops helped transform the old vegetable garden. When we return, we will follow those changes. We will watch the old plants stand beside newcomers. We will see how potatoes, tomatoes, beans, and other crops eventually altered European food culture. And in that changing garden, some medieval vegetables will begin their slow journey toward obscurity. The night settles once more. The fire grows quiet. The last sounds of the village fade, and somewhere beneath the dark soil, an old root rests patiently. It has no knowledge of history. It does not know that centuries from now, people will search for its name. It simply waits for spring. And for now, that is enough. The village is quiet again. Another night has passed over the fields, and the darkness is beginning to soften. A pale line of light appears beyond the distant hills. The roofs of the houses are still gray with shadow. Dew rests on the garden leaves. For a few moments, nothing seems to move. Then a bird calls from a hedge. A door opens. Someone steps outside. The day begins. And beneath the quiet soil, the vegetables are waiting. Some are familiar. Others belong to an older world. But before we continue among them, it is worth pausing beside the garden gate. Because the medieval vegetable garden did not remain unchanged throughout the centuries. The plants changed, the people changed, the climate changed, markets grew, trade expanded, and eventually vegetables from distant lands began to enter European kitchens. These newcomers did not immediately erase the old plants. Instead, they arrived slowly. They were tested. Some were rejected. Some were accepted as curiosities. Some became garden plants. And some eventually transformed the way people ate. The process was so gradual that an individual gardener might never have noticed how significant it was. Imagine a household garden in the late medieval or early modern period. The familiar crops are still there. Onions grow in one corner. Cabbages occupy another bed. Peas climb supports. Roots remain beneath the soil. Herbs grow close to the kitchen. But somewhere beyond the horizon, merchants, sailors, and farmers are connecting distant regions. Seeds moving. Plants are moving. Ideas are moving. The food landscape is beginning to widen. This was not yet the modern world of global supermarkets. Travel was slow. Information traveled slowly. Seeds could fail. Plants could be difficult to cultivate in unfamiliar climates. And people were often cautious about foods they did not know. Yet over generations, the movement of crops could have profound consequences. One of the most important changes came from the arrival and spread of the potato. The potato originated in the Andes of South America. It was cultivated by indigenous peoples long before Europeans encountered it. After the Spanish conquest of the Americas, potatoes were brought to Europe. At first, they were not immediately accepted as the staple food they would later become in many regions. They were unfamiliar. They belonged to a plant family that included several species known to Europeans. People had to learn how to grow and prepare them. Eventually, potatoes became important in parts of Europe. But that transformation took time. The potato story helps explain why some older vegetables declined. A potato could produce substantial food underground. It could grow in conditions where some cereal crops performed poorly. It could become part of systems of agriculture that supported large populations. As potatoes spread, they changed the balance among crops. They did not replace every medieval vegetable. But they became powerful competitors. Imagine a farmer discovering that a new crop can produce a large harvest from a relatively small area. The farmer pays attention. Neighbors pay attention. Markets pay attention. Children grow up eating it. Eventually, the new crop becomes ordinary. The old vegetables do not necessarily disappear overnight. They simply occupy less space. A garden that once held several kinds of roots may now devote more ground to another crop. This is how agricultural change often happens, not with a single decision, but with thousands of small decisions. The same process occurred with other crops from the Americas. Tomatoes arrived in Europe after the Columbian Exchange. Peppers traveled across oceans. Squashes spread into European agriculture. Different varieties of beans became important. Corn, or maize, also entered European farming. These crops did not all become equally important everywhere. Their adoption varied by climate, region, economy, and culture. But together, they contributed to a new food landscape. And as that landscape changed, some older crops became less central. This is important when we speak of forgotten medieval vegetables. Some were not replaced directly by one particular newcomer. Instead, the whole agricultural system changed. Farmers became part of wider markets. Urban populations grew. Transport improved. Food preferences shifted. Agricultural science developed. Plant breeding became more systematic, and crops were increasingly selected for qualities that mattered in commercial production. Uniform size, reliable yields, storage, transportability, appearance, taste. The modern vegetable aisle was slowly taking shape, but there was another force at work. Fashion. Food has always been influenced by fashion. A vegetable can be considered ordinary in one generation and unfashionable in another. A plant that once appeared on wealthy tables may later be associated with humble food. Another ingredient may become prestigious because it is difficult to obtain. This is not unique to vegetables. But vegetables are especially vulnerable to changes in taste because there are often many alternatives. If one leafy green becomes unpopular, another can take its place. If one root becomes inconvenient, another can fill the pot. A household does not necessarily need a specific vegetable. It needs nourishment. And if another plant can provide it more easily, the substitution becomes possible. This is part of the reason skirret faded. Skirret had useful qualities, but it had drawbacks. Its roots can be irregular. Preparing them takes effort. Modern agriculture favored other roots. Carrots improved. Parsnips continued. Potatoes became dominant. Turnips remained useful. And the space available for skirret became smaller. Eventually, most people stopped thinking about it. The plant became a curiosity, a forgotten vegetable. Now imagine holding a skirret in your hand. It is not impressive. It does not have the smooth appearance of a supermarket carrot. It looks almost tangled. You might wonder why anyone bothered growing it. But that question belongs to our world. A medieval gardener would have asked a different question. Can it grow here? Can we store it? Can we eat it? Does it provide something useful? If the answer was yes, that was enough. The same principle applies to another forgotten root, the rampion. Rampion has edible roots and leaves. Its roots were valued historically. It belongs to a group of plants that modern gardeners rarely encounter as food. Today, the name may sound more like something from a botanical book than something from a kitchen. But in an older food system, the plant had a place. And once a plant loses its place in everyday cooking, its practical knowledge begins to fade. This process can be surprisingly fast. A person may know how to prepare a vegetable because their parents taught them. Their children may learn less. Perhaps the vegetable is harder to find. Perhaps another food becomes cheaper. Perhaps a market stops selling it. Eventually, the knowledge becomes unnecessary. The plant remained somewhere. but nobody in the household cooks it. Then one generation passes. Another follows. The plant's name survives only in old books or local memories. The disappearance of food knowledge can therefore happen without any formal event. No law needs to be passed. No announcement needs to be made. People simply stop planting. Now let us return to the leafy vegetables. Auroch is another example. Auroch could provide edible leaves and was used historically in European cooking. Its close relatives include plants that remain familiar. Yet auroch itself became less common. Spinach became increasingly important. Chard remained popular in various regions. Other greens filled the same role. Once several plants can perform similar functions, competition between them becomes natural. A cook might choose the green that is easier to obtain. A gardener might choose the one that grows better. A farmer might choose the crop that sells. The older plant slowly loses ground. This is not necessarily a failure, it is adaptation. People adapt their food systems to changing circumstances. But every adaptation creates winners and losers, and the losers can become forgotten. There is something almost peaceful about imagining this process, because it usually happens so slowly. A garden bed is planted with one vegetable. Years later, a different vegetable occupies it. The fence remains. The house remains. The path remains. Only the leaves are different. A visitor from one century might not recognize the garden of another. The landscape looks familiar. The plants have changed. This is especially true of the medieval kitchen garden. The garden was not static. It was constantly being adjusted. A crop that performed well might be given more space. A plant that failed might be abandoned. Seeds could be exchanged between households. Merchants could bring new varieties. Gardeners could experiment. And weather could force changes. A colder climate could favor certain crops. A warmer period could allow others to thrive. The medieval period itself included significant climatic variation. The so-called medieval warm period, or medieval climate anomaly, was not a uniform warming across all of Europe or the world, and conditions varied by region and time. Later, parts of Europe experienced colder conditions during the period often called the Little Ice Age. These changes affected agriculture in complex ways, but plants always live within climate. A crop's success depends on temperature, rainfall, soil, and the timing of seasons. A garden that works well in one century may require different choices in another. This is why hardy vegetables were valuable. A plant that could tolerate difficult conditions had a practical advantage. Sea kale is a good example of resilience. It naturally grows in coastal environments. It does not require the rich soil of an intensively managed vegetable field. It can live among stones and sand. Its young shoots can be eaten. For communities near suitable coasts, such plants could be part of local food knowledge. But coastal plants faced another problem. They were often strongly associated with particular environments. If a community moved away from those environments, the knowledge could travel poorly. A vegetable that made perfect sense beside the sea might seem irrelevant inland. And once a food becomes regional, it becomes vulnerable to cultural change. Another generation may prefer crops that are more widely available. Markets may supply alternatives. the old plant becomes less necessary. The same thing happened with many local greens. They were perfectly suited to their environment. But modern agriculture often rewards crops that can be grown across large areas. A local plant may be excellent, but a standardized crop can be easier to distribute. This is one of the hidden forces behind the modern diet. Uniformity. The vegetables in a modern market are often remarkably consistent. The carrots have similar shapes. The onions are similar in size. The cabbages look familiar. This consistency is useful for commerce, but it represents a narrowing of agricultural diversity. Historically, there were many local varieties. They might differ in color, size, flavor, and growing season. Some were adapted to particular soils. Others could survive local weather. When those varieties disappeared, genetic diversity could also decline. This does not mean medieval agriculture was perfectly diverse. It had its own vulnerabilities. Crop failures could be devastating. Diseases could spread. Local varieties could be lost. But modern systems introduced a different kind of vulnerability through specialization. The story of forgotten vegetables, therefore, has another layer. It is not simply about unusual food. It is about biodiversity. A garden containing many crops has many stories. A garden containing only a few crops is simpler. But simplicity can come with risks. The old gardener understood this through experience, not necessarily through scientific theory. If one crop failed, another might survive. If one vegetable disliked wet soil, another might tolerate it. If one variety stored poorly, another might last longer. Knowledge of many plants gave households options. Now imagine returning to a medieval village after a heavy storm. Rain has fallen for hours. The paths are muddy. Water stands between the rows. Some plants have bent under the weight. Others remain upright. A gardener looks over the damage. There is disappointment. But not everything has failed. Some roots are protected underground. Some hardy greens remain. Some perennial plants are still standing. The garden has resilience because it is not one single crop. This is one reason old vegetables can still interest modern gardeners. They may offer traits that modern varieties do not always emphasize: hardiness, cold tolerance, long harvest seasons, perennial growth, resistance to neglect, adaptation to local soils. Of course, an old vegetable is not automatically better. Historical crops can have weaknesses too. Some are slow. Some are difficult to harvest. Some have strong flavors. Some produce small yields. The past should not be romanticized. The value lies in diversity and knowledge, not in assuming that everything old was superior. And this brings us back to the human side of the story. What does it mean to forget a vegetable? At first, it means fewer seeds are planted. Then, fewer people recognize the plant. Then, fewer cooks know how to prepare it. Eventually, its name sounds strange. A plant that was once ordinary becomes historical. But the opposite can also happen. A forgotten vegetable can return. A gardener discovers it. A seed is preserved. A historical recipe is studied. A community becomes interested in local food. A restaurant experiments with an old crop. A garden begins growing it again. Suddenly, a plant that seemed lost becomes visible. This has happened with several traditional vegetables in modern times. The revival of old crops is part of a wider interest in agricultural heritage. People may want to preserve rare varieties. They may want to explore historical flavors. They may value plants adapted to local conditions. Or they may simply enjoy discovering foods that feel different. There is something gentle about growing a vegetable that has passed through centuries. The seed goes into the soil. Days pass. A small shoot appears. The gardener watches it. The plant grows. Leaves unfold. Eventually, something edible forms. The same basic cycle that once happened in a medieval garden happens again. The world around it is different. The tools are different. The buildings are different. But the plant still responds to sunlight and water. That continuity can be surprisingly powerful. Now let us walk deeper into the old garden. There is a patch of leafy greens. Some have broad leaves. Others are narrow. One plant is taller than the rest. Another lies close to the soil. The gardener knows them by sight. We may not. This difference between recognition and ignorance is central to food history. To know a plant is to see possibilities. To not know, it is to see weeds. Imagine finding a wild plant beside a medieval path. A modern visitor might walk past. A medieval villager might stop. Perhaps the leaves are edible. Perhaps the roots are useful. Perhaps it has a medicinal role. Perhaps it is simply not worth gathering. Knowledge determines the decision. The landscape itself is interpreted through memory. This is why the loss of traditional knowledge can change how people experience nature. A meadow can become empty when you no longer know what grows there. A hedgerow can become merely a boundary. A stream can become scenery. But to someone with deep local knowledge, these places are full of resources. The medieval landscape was not necessarily untouched nature. People had been shaping it for centuries. They cleared land, grazed animals, cut hedges, managed woods, cultivated fields, gathered wild plants. The boundary between human and natural space was constantly shifting. Vegetables existed within that larger relationship. Some were carefully cultivated. Others lived halfway between garden and wild landscape. Alexander's is a good example. It could grow in disturbed and coastal places and was used as food. A plant like this reminds us that food did not always begin in a neat row. Sometimes it began at the edge of the path, at the edge of the field, near a wall, beside water, or on the coast. The medieval pantry was therefore larger than the kitchen garden. It included fields, orchards, woodlands, hedgerows, streams, marshes, and shorelines. Each landscape had its own foods. As we continue into the afternoon, the sun moves lower. Shadows stretch across the garden. The gardener gathers what is needed for the evening: a few roots, some leaves, perhaps onions, perhaps peas. The harvest is modest, but the household has enough for a meal. This was the scale at which many food decisions were made, not by governments, not by agricultural corporations, but by families, by gardeners, by farmers, by cooks. Small decisions accumulated into large historical changes. One family stopped planting skirret. Another planted more turnips. A farmer tried a new variety of carrot. A gardener saved seeds from a particularly good cabbage. A merchant carried a new crop to another town. A cook learned a new method, and centuries later, the combined result is the food landscape we know. The forgotten vegetable is therefore a reminder that history is not only made by famous people, it is made by ordinary choices. A seed placed in soil, a root lifted from the ground, a leaf added to a pot, a recipe remembered, a recipe forgotten. These small acts can shape centuries. The evening is approaching again. Smoke rises from the houses. The smell of wood burning mixes with the smell of cooking. The fields become golden in the fading light. Somewhere, animals are being brought toward their shelters. The garden is almost empty of activity, but the plants remain. Tomorrow, someone will return, and the cycle will continue. Yet there is still one important question. Why did some medieval vegetables disappear while others survived? The answer is not one thing. Sometimes, the vegetable was difficult to grow commercially. Sometimes, its flavor became unpopular. Sometimes, another crop offered greater yields. Sometimes, a new crop arrived. Sometimes, food markets changed. Sometimes, agricultural practices changed. Sometimes, the plant was too local. Sometimes, its traditional knowledge was simply lost. And sometimes, several of these things happen together. This is why there is rarely a single moment when a vegetable becomes forgotten. Its disappearance is usually a slow narrowing. First, it becomes less common. Then, it becomes regional. Then, it becomes unusual. Then it becomes something gardeners grow only for interest. And finally, many people have never heard of it. The vegetable has not necessarily vanished. The memory of eating it has. That may be the most fragile part. Plants can survive in soil. Seeds can survive in storage. But culinary knowledge depends on people. Someone must know what to do with the harvest. Without that knowledge, the vegetable becomes little more than a botanical curiosity. And perhaps this is why old vegetables are worth remembering. Not because medieval food was better. Not because every forgotten plant should return to modern kitchens. But because each plant tells us something about adaptation, about local knowledge, about the seasons, about hunger and abundance, about markets, about taste, about the relationship between people and land. As darkness gathers over the village once more, the garden becomes almost invisible. The outlines of the plants fade. The wind moves softly through the leaves. The soil holds the day's warmth for a little while longer. Inside a house, a meal is being eaten. There is nothing remarkable about it. That is exactly what makes it remarkable to us. Because ordinary meals disappear more completely than almost anything else. The bowl is emptied. The pot is cleaned. The fire settles. The people sleep. But somewhere in the soil, seeds remain. And centuries later, a gardener may open an old packet, read an unfamiliar name, and place those seeds into the earth. Perhaps Skirret, perhaps Good King Henry, perhaps Orak, perhaps another forgotten plant. The seed does not know that it has traveled through history. It simply waits. Then, under suitable conditions, it begins to grow. And when the first green leaves appear, the old story starts again. Not exactly as it was, never exactly, but close enough to remind us that the past is not always gone. Sometimes it is sleeping beneath the soil. And with the next morning, we will follow that memory further. We will leave the familiar garden paths and enter the places where medieval people gathered food from hedges, woods, rivers, marshes, and coastlines. There, among plants that were neither fully cultivated nor completely wild, we will discover another side of the forgotten vegetable world. The night is quiet now. The houses are dark. The garden rests. And beneath the earth, the roots remain still, waiting for another season, waiting for another hand, waiting, perhaps, to be remembered. The night has settled gently over the village. The last warmth from the hearth has faded into the stones. Outside, the garden is hidden beneath darkness. Only the faint outlines of the fence and trees can be seen. Beyond the houses, the fields stretch toward the woods. And somewhere farther away, a stream moves quietly through the countryside. By morning, the landscape will look different again. But for now, let us leave the cultivated garden behind. Because medieval people did not find all of their food inside neat rows. The countryside itself could provide edible plants. Some grew beside roads. Some appeared along hedges. Some lived near streams. Others grew in marshes, woodland clearings, meadows, and coastal ground. To modern eyes, many of these places might look like ordinary scenery. To someone with local knowledge, they could be part of the food landscape. Imagine walking along a narrow medieval path just after sunrise. Your shoes become damp from the grass. The air smells of wet leaves. Birds are calling from the hedges. There is no paved road here, only packed earth, stones, and mud. Along the edge of the path, small plants rise between the grasses. Most would be ignored, but some would have been recognized immediately. This knowledge of edible plants was not necessarily written down. It could be learned from parents, grandparents, neighbors, shepherds, gardeners, and people who spent much of their lives outdoors. A child might watch an older person gather young leaves. They would learn by seeing. They would learn which plants were useful, which were bitter, which were best in spring, which were better after cooking, and which should simply be left alone. This was practical knowledge. It was part of living in a landscape. One of the plants that belongs to this older world is nettle. Today, nettles are often treated as weeds. Their sting makes people cautious. But nettles have a long history of human use. Young nettle leaves can be eaten when properly prepared. They can be cooked like greens. They have also been used for other purposes, including fiber. Imagine a medieval household gathering young nettles in spring. The leaves are handled carefully. They are brought into the kitchen. Heat removes the sting. The result is a green food that costs almost nothing to grow. The plant is already there. It has survived the winter. It is emerging before many cultivated vegetables are fully ready. For a household trying to make the most of local resources, that could matter. Nettles remind us that the medieval food system included plants we would not normally call vegetables today. The category was broader. People did not need to separate wild food, garden food, and medicinal plants into the neat categories we use now. A plant could belong to several worlds at once. This is also true of sorrel. Sorrel has been gathered and cultivated as a leafy plant for centuries. Its leaves have distinctive sour flavor, because they contain oxalic acid. In small culinary quantities, that sharpness could bring variety to simple meals. Imagine a pot of mild food. Grains, perhaps peas, perhaps onions. The taste may be gentle and earthy. Then a handful of sour leaves is added. Suddenly the meal has another character. Medieval cooks understood flavor through experience. They did not need modern nutritional language to know that a particular leaf made a dish more pleasant. They simply knew what worked. This practical knowledge was one of the strengths of traditional cooking. A cook learned through repetition. A gardener learned through seasons. A household learned through necessity. And those lessons could remain alive for generations. But there was another source of knowledge: the market. In towns, people could buy foods that they did not grow themselves. Market stalls might offer vegetables, herbs, fruits, grains, and other foods. Urban life changed the relationship between people and plants. A person living in a crowded town might have limited garden space. They could depend more on cellars. A rural household might grow many of its own vegetables. A town household might purchase them. This difference could influence which crops became common. If a vegetable sold well, market gardeners had a reason to grow more of it. If people stopped asking for another vegetable, farmers had less reason to plant it. Again, a forgotten vegetable could disappear quietly. The market did not need to announce its disappearance. Demand simply declined. A stall stopped carrying it. A grower planted something else. A customer bought another vegetable, and the old plant slowly became rare. This is one of the hidden stories of food history. Popularity can shape agriculture as powerfully as climate. Taste can change the countryside. Now imagine entering a medieval town market. The streets are narrow. The buildings lean slightly over the road. Wooden shutters open. People begin arranging their goods. The air contains many smells. Smoke, fresh bread, animal manure, herbs, damp wool, vegetables, fish in some places. The market is noisy compared with the quiet countryside, but the sounds are still human and close. Voices rise and fall. Coins pass from hand to hand. A seller calls attention to produce. A customer examines roots. Another person chooses onions. Among the familiar foods, there might be vegetables that are now rarely seen. Not necessarily because they were exotic. They may simply have belonged to another time. A market is a place where food traditions meet. Farmers bring crops from the surrounding countryside. Travelers may bring seeds from farther away. Merchants connect regions. A new vegetable can enter through such networks. At first, it may be rare. Only a few people grow it. Only a few cooks know what to do with it. But curiosity can spread. One garden tries it. Another follows. The crop becomes established. Over time, the older vegetable loses space. This is how the garden can change without anyone deliberately trying to erase its past. Let us imagine one of those newcomers. A plant arrives from another region. Its seeds are small. A gardener places them in good soil. The first season is uncertain. Perhaps the plant grows poorly. Perhaps it grows surprisingly well. The gardener saves seeds. The following year there are more. Soon neighbors notice. A cook experiments. A merchant asks for it. The the crop begins to spread. This process could take years or decades. But once a new crop became established, it could become part of local tradition. What was once foreign became ordinary. This happened repeatedly across European food history. And while new vegetables entered the landscape, older ones moved in the opposite direction. Some were still grown, but less often. Some remained in monasteries. Some survived in household gardens. Some became associated with rural poverty. This last point is important. Food carries social meaning. A vegetable can become unfashionable because it is associated with people who are considered poor. If wealthier households begin serving different foods, those foods can acquire prestige. A humble vegetable may then become something people avoid when they can afford alternatives. The plant itself has not changed. Its social meaning has. This can contribute to decline. Imagine a child growing up in a household where an old vegetable is still eaten. The child later moves to a town. They discover different foods. They become familiar with new tastes. Perhaps they stop growing the old plant. Their children never learn it. The food tradition ends within a single family line. Multiply that by thousands of households over many generations, and a vegetable can disappear from common use. There is no single villain. There is simply change. Now, let us return to the woods. Woodland edges were important spaces in medieval landscapes. People gathered fuel there. They collected timber and other materials. Animals grazed in some managed woodland systems, and edible plants could grow beneath the trees. Wild garlic is one example. Its leaves and bulbs have long been used as food in parts of Europe. In spring, its strong scent can make it easy to recognize. Imagine walking through damp woodland in early spring. The ground is soft. The trees are still partly bare. Light reaches the forest floor, and suddenly you notice a fresh green smell. The leaves of wild garlic are growing in patches. For someone familiar with the plant, the location may be remembered year after year. The woodland becomes a seasonal pantry. But wild garlic also illustrates an important difference between gathering and cultivation. A gathered plant depends on the landscape remaining suitable. If woodland is cleared, the plant may disappear. If grazing changes, the vegetation can change. If paths shift, gathering places may become harder to reach. Food traditions are therefore connected to land management. When landscapes change, diets can change with them. The same is true of wetland plants. Marshes and damp meadows could contain useful greens. Watercress could grow in suitable streams. Some plants were gathered from watery places, but wetlands were often transformed by human activity. Drainage changed landscapes. Fields expanded. Settlements grew. Rivers were managed. The result was a different countryside. A plant that once grew abundantly could become less common simply because its habitat changed. This is another reason vegetables can be forgotten. The knowledge may survive, but the place where the plant once grew may no longer exist. Imagine returning to a familiar stream after many centuries. The medieval stream may have been wider or differently managed. The banks may have been covered with different vegetation. The surrounding land may have been pasture or woodland. Today, the same place could be a canal, a drained field, or a heavily altered waterway. The plant is not merely forgotten, its home has changed. This is why the history of food is also environmental history. Plants depend on landscapes. People change landscapes. And those changes affect what can be eaten. The medieval garden itself was also shaped by the environment. Soil quality mattered. A garden could be improved with manure. Compost-like materials could be used. Ashes and other household materials could enter the soil. Farm animals were part of the system. Their manure helped return nutrients to fields and gardens. Nothing existed separately. The household was a cycle. Food went from soil to plant. Plant went to person or animal. Waste returned to the earth. The cycle continued. This system could be productive, but it required constant labor. Gardens did not simply grow food by themselves. Weeding was necessary. Watering could be necessary. Soil needed attention. Seeds had to be saved. Plants had to be protected. And harvesting had to happen at the right time. A forgotten vegetable could therefore disappear for a very practical reason. Perhaps it required too much work for too little food. If another plant produced more with less labor, the choice was obvious. This is especially important when considering medieval farmers. They were not collecting rare vegetables simply because they were interesting. They had work to do. They needed food. They needed reliable crops. They needed to manage risk. The best vegetable was often the one that justified its place in the garden. This brings us to a plant called sea beet. Sea beet is the wild ancestor of several important cultivated crops, including beetroot and chard. It grows naturally along European coasts and has been gathered as a leafy vegetable. It is a fascinating example because its descendants became much more important than the wild plant itself. Humans gradually selected different forms of beet for different purposes. Some were selected for roots, some for leaves, some for other qualities. Over generations, the plant family diversified. The medieval world knew some forms of beet and related greens, but modern varieties represent much later selection and breeding. When we look at a modern beetroot, we are seeing the result of a long agricultural history. The plant itself is ancient. Its familiar form is not. This pattern appears again and again. Modern vegetables are often the descendants of older plants that look different. Farmers selected. Gardeners experimented. Seeds were saved. Markets influenced choices. The result was gradual transformation. So, when we imagine a medieval vegetable, we should avoid placing modern vegetables into the past unchanged. A medieval carrot was not necessarily the same as the carrot in a supermarket today. A medieval beet was not necessarily the same as the beetroot on a modern plate. Cabbages had many forms. Leafy greens varied. Roots varied. Even familiar onions and leeks existed in forms shaped by the agriculture of their time. The vegetable garden was always changing. Now, as evening approaches, imagine returning from the fields. The sun is low. The air has become cooler. A basket hangs from your hand. Inside are gathered greens. Some are cultivated. Some are wild. Their leaves are still damp. You pass the garden gate. The plants there look familiar now. You know that each has its season. Each has its purpose. The evening meal is prepared. Perhaps the greens are washed. Some are chopped. A pot is placed over the fire. The smell rises slowly. There is no need for complicated presentation. Food is being prepared to feed people. This simple fact connects us to the medieval household more strongly than almost anything else. Whatever their social position, people had to eat. And food had to come from somewhere. The forgotten vegetable was part of that ordinary reality. It was not a decorative curiosity. It was part of someone's meal. Perhaps a monk ate it. Perhaps a farmer. Perhaps a child. Perhaps a traveler. Perhaps a wealthy household served it beside other foods. The plant moved through society in different ways. Some vegetables were more common among ordinary people. Others could appear in wealthy kitchens as well. And some were associated with particular regions. There was no single medieval diet, but there was a shared dependence on seasonal food. The calendar was always present. Spring meant one collection of plants. Summer brought another. Autumn brought roots and stored crops. Winter reduced the range of fresh food. Then the cycle began again. The calendar governed the kitchen. This is difficult to appreciate in a modern world where many vegetables are available throughout the year. We can buy lettuce in winter, tomatoes in cold months, peppers at almost any time. Fresh greens can travel thousands of kilometers. The season can become almost invisible. For medieval households, it was difficult to ignore. The season determined what was growing. It determined what could be harvested. It determined what needed to be preserved. And it determined which forgotten vegetables were valuable. A plant that appeared very early could be important. A plant that remained productive late in the season could also be important. A root that survived winter could be invaluable. This is why good King Henry, skirret, parsnips, turnips, and other traditional crops belong to a seasonal system rather than a modern supermarket system. They were pieces of a yearly puzzle, and when agriculture changed, the puzzle changed. The introduction of new crops was one part. The expansion of markets was another. Changing tastes were another. Improved breeding was another. And industrial agriculture eventually became another. Over time, vegetables were increasingly grown on larger scales. The old local varieties could struggle to compete. A commercial vegetable needed to behave predictably. It needed to grow well. It needed to survive transport. It needed to look acceptable. And ideally, it needed to produce a good yield. The old irregular root might not fit those requirements. The local green might have too short a season. The perennial vegetable might not produce enough at once. The wild plant might be impossible to standardize. So the market favored certain crops. Again, the forgotten vegetables were not necessarily bad. They were simply less suited to the new system. This distinction matters. When a plant disappears, it is tempting to imagine that people discovered it was inferior. Often, that is not what happened. The criteria changed. The vegetable was judged by a new set of needs, and it lost. This is one of the quiet tragedies of agricultural history. Not tragedy in the sense of catastrophe. Rather, the loss of something small, a flavor, a seed variety, a local tradition, a seasonal habit, a plant name, a way of looking at the landscape. Each disappearance leaves the world slightly narrower. But there is also hope. Seeds can survive. Historical records can survive. Old gardens can be reconstructed, and people can choose to grow forgotten crops again. A plant can return to the garden. A forgotten recipe can be tested. A local community can recover an old name. The past can become visible again. Perhaps this is why the idea of forgotten vegetables continues to fascinate people. It reminds us that the food world has always been larger than the foods we happen to know. There are thousands of plants that humans have eaten at different times and places. Some became staples. Some remained local. Some disappeared. Some returned. The story is never finished. As the evening becomes darker, the village settles. The market is empty. The paths are quiet. The garden gate is closed. The woods beyond the houses are dark. The stream continues its slow journey. The same landscape that provided food during the day now becomes almost invisible. But the plants are still there, some beneath the soil, some along the water, some beneath the trees, some sleeping through the night. And this is where our journey will continue, because we have seen the gardens, we have followed the paths, we have visited the markets and wild landscapes, but we have not yet followed the vegetables into the kitchen deeply enough. What did these plants actually taste like? How were they prepared? What did medieval cooks do when a vegetable was bitter? How did they combine roots, greens, herbs, grains, and legumes? And why did certain flavors disappear from European cooking, while others became familiar? To answer those questions, we will return to the hearth. There, the forgotten vegetables will become food again. The roots will be washed. The leaves will be cut. The pots will begin to simmer. And in the warm, dim light of the medieval kitchen, we will listen to the quiet sounds of cooking. The knife against the wooden board, the soft bubbling of water, the crackle of firewood, the faint scent of onions, the earthy smell of roots, the sharp freshness of herbs. Outside, the night wind will move through the garden. Inside, dinner will slowly take shape. And for a little while, the forgotten vegetables will no longer be forgotten. They will simply be food, as they once were. The fire burns quietly now. The last light has disappeared from the sky. The household settles into sleep. And beneath the garden soil, the old plants remain, waiting for spring, waiting for rain, waiting for the next human hand to uncover their roots, waiting, perhaps, for someone to remember their names. The village is quiet beneath the last hours of darkness. The houses are still. The fields rest beneath the night sky. A soft wind moves through the hedges, and somewhere beyond the gardens, a stream continues its slow journey through the countryside. Inside one small house, the embers of the hearth give off a faint red glow. The fire has almost gone out. But there is still warmth in the room, and there is still the smell of yesterday's cooking in the air. Roots, onions, wood smoke, dried herbs. These simple smells would have been familiar to people living many centuries ago. Tonight, we return to the kitchen, not to imagine a grand feast, not to recreate a meal perfectly, but simply to understand how forgotten vegetables could become part of ordinary food. Imagine a medieval cook beginning the day's work. The kitchen is cool. The stone floor holds the night's chill. A small fire is being rebuilt. Wood catches slowly. A few dry pieces begin to glow. Soon, the room fills with warmth. Outside, morning light reaches the garden. Inside, vegetables are being brought toward the hearth. Some are roots, some are leaves, some are herbs. Some may have been gathered from the surrounding landscape. The cook knows what each one can do. A root may need peeling. A leaf may need washing. A strong-tasting plant may need to be combined with milder ingredients. Nothing is treated as an isolated object. Everything belongs to a meal. This is important because medieval cooking was often about balance. A cook had to work with what was available. A vegetable might be earthy. Another might be sweet. Another might be sharp. Another might be bitter. Herbs could add fragrance. Salt could change a dish. Spices, when available, could add entirely different flavors. The result was not necessarily bland. Medieval cooking could be richly flavored, especially in households that could afford imported spices. But ordinary meals were often shaped by local ingredients and household resources. The forgotten vegetables belonged to that world. Take skirret again. Its natural sweetness could make it useful in dishes where a cook wanted a mild, sweet note. The roots could be boiled or otherwise cooked. They might be eaten alongside other foods. The exact preparation varied by place and period, but the important thing is that the vegetable was flexible enough to have a place in the kitchen. Now imagine parsnips. Their pale roots have been cleaned. They are placed into a pot. The water begins to warm. Steam rises. The smell is earthy and faintly sweet. There is something deeply familiar about this scene. A person preparing a root vegetable today might perform many of the same basic actions. Wash, cut, cook, taste, adjust. The tools may differ, the kitchen may differ, but the sequence is ancient. Food history often feels distant until we reach these small moments. Then the distance becomes smaller. A hand holds a root. A knife cuts it. A fire cooks it. A person tastes it. The same human senses are involved: smell, taste, touch, hunger, comfort. These have changed very little. Now let us think about greens. Good King Henry, orache, sorrel, nettle, wild garlic. These plants offered different flavors and textures. Some were mild, some were sour. Some were aromatic. Some became tender when cooked. Others could be eaten when young. A medieval cook did not need to know the modern botanical relationships between these plants. The cook only needed practical knowledge. When is it ready? Which part should I use? How should I prepare it? What can I combine it with? That knowledge could be remarkably precise. It might come from years of experience. A child could learn by watching. A young cook could learn through repetition. And an experienced cook could know the difference between a good harvest and a poor one simply by looking at the leaves. This kind of knowledge rarely appears in grand historical records. There are no monuments to it, but it shaped daily life. Imagine a medieval child standing near the garden. Perhaps they are helping an older family member. They are told which leaves to gather. They learn where the plants grow. They learn what they look like. They learn when the roots are ready. At first, the knowledge seems ordinary, but years later, the child becomes the person teaching someone else. That is how food traditions survive. One generation passes them to another, and that is also how they disappear. If the child leaves the village, moves to a town, changes occupation, or begins buying different food, some knowledge may not be passed on. The chain weakens. One plant becomes less familiar, then another. Eventually, the garden changes. This is why forgotten vegetables are also forgotten memories. They represent information that once lived inside people. Now, imagine the market again. The town has become busier. More people live there. Farmers bring produce from surrounding areas. The variety of foods may be greater than in a small rural household. But the market also creates competition. Some vegetables become more profitable. Others become difficult to sell. A farmer may discover that customers want a particular root. The next year, more land is planted with it. Another crop receives less space. The process repeats. Markets encourage standardization. A customer expects a certain shape. A merchant wants produce that survives transport. A farmer wants reliable yields. Gradually, the vegetables that fit the system become more common. The vegetables that do not fit become rare. This helps explain why many traditional crops survived only in small gardens. A household gardener can grow a vegetable simply because they like it. A commercial farmer has different pressures. The farmer must think about yield, labor, storage, demand, transport, price, risk. The old vegetable may be perfectly good, but if it does not make economic sense, it may disappear from fields. And once fewer farms grow it, fewer people eat it. Once fewer people eat it, fewer people ask for it. The cycle continues. This is how a vegetable can vanish from ordinary life without ever becoming extinct. The plant remains. The habit disappears. And perhaps centuries later, someone finds its name again. This pattern can be seen in many traditional crops. Some were rediscovered by gardeners. Others were preserved in seed banks. Some survived in remote regions. Some remained part of local cuisines. There is no single ending for a forgotten vegetable. Each has its own path. Some truly disappeared. Some became rare. Some returned. Some were transformed into modern varieties, and some survived under different names. This is especially true when we consider the broad families of vegetables: beets, carrots, cabbages, onions, peas, beans. Many modern vegetables have deep historical roots, but the forms we eat today are the result of centuries of selection. A medieval gardener would recognize some of their relatives. But the exact shape, color, flavor, and yield might be different. This means that the modern vegetable garden is not separate from the medieval one. It is its descendant. The old garden did not vanish completely. It changed. Some plants survived. Others were replaced. Some were crossed or selected. Some became new varieties. Some disappeared. The modern garden is therefore a layered landscape. Underneath its familiar vegetables are centuries of human decisions. A carrot contains that history. A cabbage contains it. A beet contains it. Even the humble onion carries the memory of countless gardens. This is why we should not think of the medieval vegetable garden as a strange world that suddenly ended. It slowly became the garden we know. The transition took centuries, and during that transition, plants moved in and out. Some foreign crops became familiar. Some old crops became obscure. Some local varieties disappeared. Others spread far beyond their original regions. The potato became one of the great examples. The tomato became another. Neither belonged to medieval European agriculture in its later familiar form. Both came from the Americas. Their arrival was part of a much larger movement of plants, animals, foods, and diseases between continents after European contact with the Americas. This exchange transformed diets around the world, but the change was gradual. A new plant did not instantly become a staple. People had to cultivate it. They had to understand it. They had to decide whether they liked it, and different societies made different choices. This reminds us that food culture is never simply imposed by nature. People choose. They experiment. They imitate neighbors. They follow fashion. They respond to hunger. They respond to prices. And over time, those choices become tradition. A food that once seemed strange can become something people believe has always been part of their culture. The history disappears beneath familiarity. That is why the modern tomato can feel completely European in some cuisines, even though its origins lie across the Atlantic. The same is true of potatoes in many European countries. History has a way of becoming invisible once a food becomes ordinary. The forgotten vegetables show us the opposite process. They were once ordinary. Then they became unusual. Now we have to search for them. Perhaps that is the most interesting transformation of all. Imagine taking a modern gardener back in time. They enter a medieval kitchen garden. They see rows of plants. Some are recognizable, others are not. They might see carrots of different colors, leafy greens with unfamiliar names, roots that look irregular, herbs growing beside vegetables, perennial plants returning from old roots. They might ask where the potatoes are. There are none. Where are the tomatoes? None. Where are the peppers? None. The garden feels familiar and strange at the same time. Then imagine taking a medieval gardener into a modern supermarket. The experience would be reversed. Bright colors, uniform shapes, vegetables from distant climates, fresh produce in winter. Rows of food that could never have appeared in a medieval market. The modern gardener would understand the abundance. The medieval gardener might be amazed by the variety, but perhaps both would notice something similar. A vegetable is still a vegetable. A root is still a root. A leaf is still a leaf. The soil remains the beginning. And that connection brings us back to the garden. The sun is now rising. The old medieval morning has become brighter. Birds move through the hedges. The dew begins to disappear. The soil warms. A gardener walks between the rows. The work begins again. Perhaps they check the cabbages. Perhaps they pull a few weeds. Perhaps they examine the roots. Perhaps they gather greens for the kitchen. There is no hurry. The work follows the season. The garden does not care about history. It responds to weather. Rain, sun, cold, warmth. The plants grow according to their own rhythms. This is something modern life can make easy to forget. We can eat outside the season. We can transport food across oceans. We can preserve almost anything. We can manipulate growing conditions. But the medieval gardener lived much closer to natural rhythms. Not because life was simpler, it was often harder, but because there were fewer ways to escape the season. Winter had to be prepared for. Spring had to be used. Summer harvests had to be gathered. Autumn stores had to be protected. Every season mattered. This is why the forgotten vegetables were important. They filled gaps. They survived conditions. They provided variety. They could be stored. They returned every year. They helped households move through the calendar. A vegetable could be valuable not because it was spectacular, but because it appeared at the right time. A plant that grew early could bridge winter and spring. A root that stored well could carry food into the cold months. A perennial green could return without being replanted. A hardy coastal plant could provide food where cultivated crops struggled. Each plant had a place, and when the agricultural system changed, those places changed too. Some became unnecessary. Some became inconvenient. Some were replaced. Some were forgotten. But none of this means the old foods should be viewed only with nostalgia. The medieval world had hunger, poor harvests, food shortages, unequal access, hard physical labor, limited storage, disease, and unpredictable weather. Food was not romantic. It was necessary. A vegetable could mean nourishment. It could mean another meal. It could mean one more option when supplies were low. So when we remember these plants, we should remember the people who depended on them. Farmers working wet fields, gardeners kneeling in cold soil, children carrying baskets, cooks tending pots, people gathering greens beside streams, people storing roots for winter, people saving seeds for another year. The forgotten vegetables belonged to their lives. They were part of the ordinary work of staying alive. And perhaps this is why the story feels so quiet. There is no single dramatic moment. No great battle decided the fate of Skirt. No king declared that good King Henry should disappear. No army marched against Auric. These vegetables simply became less necessary. Other crops arrived. Markets changed. Tastes shifted. Agriculture developed. And the old plants slowly moved toward the edges. That is often how history happens. Quietly. Through repetition. Through small choices. Through habits that change so gradually that nobody notices. One generation eats a vegetable often. The next eats it sometimes. The next knows its name but rarely tastes it. The next has never heard of it. And suddenly, something that was once ordinary becomes forgotten. But forgetting is not always permanent. There are people today who preserve traditional varieties. Gardeners who grow old crops. Researchers who study historical agriculture, communities that protect local food traditions, seed collections that keep rare varieties alive. These efforts matter because agricultural history is not only about the past, it can influence the future. A forgotten plant may contain useful traits. It may tolerate local conditions. It may provide a different growing season. It may offer genetic diversity. Or it may simply remind us that there are many ways to feed ourselves. The lesson is not that we should abandon modern vegetables. It is that variety has value. The past gives us a wider library of possibilities. And sometimes, opening that library reveals something unexpectedly beautiful. A small root, an unusual leaf, a plant with a strange name, a food that once seemed completely ordinary. Now imagine the garden one last time. The sun is high enough to warm the leaves. The morning mist has disappeared. The soil is no longer cold. A breeze moves through the rows. You walk slowly between the plants. You recognize some. Others still seem unfamiliar. There is skirret. Its roots are hidden beneath the earth. There is good King Henry. Its leaves rise from the soil. There is auroch. There are herbs. There are onions. There are cabbages. There may be sorrel. Perhaps a few wild greens have been gathered nearby. The garden is not large. It does not need to be. It contains enough to tell a story about food, a story about seasons, a story about people, and a story about memory. The plants are quiet. They do not announce themselves. They simply grow. This may be why they are so easy to forget. The most important things in human history are often ordinary. Bread, water, fire, soil, seeds, vegetables. The things people touched every day rarely leave grand monuments. But they shaped lives more consistently than monuments ever could. A vegetable garden may seem small beside a medieval castle, but the castle could not feed itself. The people inside depended on food, and food depended on fields, gardens, animals, water, weather, and labor. The humble garden was part of the foundation. It supported households. It filled pots. It carried families through seasons. And its plants became part of the rhythm of life. Now the afternoon is fading. The garden is quiet again. A basket of vegetables has been carried toward the house. The door closes. A fire begins to burn. Soon, a meal will be prepared. The same simple actions begin again. Wash, cut, cook, eat. Nothing dramatic. Nothing grand. Just life. And somewhere in that meal, perhaps, is a forgotten vegetable, a root once common, a leaf once familiar, a plant that has survived centuries of change. As evening comes, the first stars appear. The garden darkens. The plants become silhouettes. The soil cools, and the old village settles into another night. We can almost hear the quiet sounds. A door closing. Footsteps on the path. Wood moving in the hearth. The faint rustle of leaves. Perhaps an owl somewhere beyond the houses. Then silence. The garden rests, and beneath it, the roots remain. Some will be harvested tomorrow. Some will remain until winter. Some will produce seeds. Some will return next spring. That is the quiet persistence of plants. People come and go. Gardens change. Markets change. Recipes change. But seeds can wait. They can cross generations. They can disappear and return. They can sleep in the soil until someone gives them another chance. And perhaps this is the final lesson of the forgotten medieval vegetables. Food history is not only a record of what disappeared, it is also a record of what survived. Every vegetable on a modern table is part of that story. Some are ancient survivors. Some are descendants of wild plants. Some were shaped by medieval gardeners. Some were transformed by later farmers. Some crossed oceans. Some were almost forgotten. And some are waiting to be rediscovered. The garden we began with is no longer only a medieval garden. It has become a bridge. Behind us are the old paths, the stone houses, the wooden fences, the hearths, the fields, the market stalls, the streams, the woods, and all the people who once worked among them. Ahead of us is the modern world. A world of supermarkets and seed catalogs. A world where vegetables can travel enormous distances. A world where a forgotten plant can be rediscovered with a few words and a packet of seeds. The distance between these worlds is enormous. But the connection is still there. It is in the soil. It is in the seed. It is in the act of planting. It is in the simple act of cooking a root over a fire. And it is in the human desire to remember what came before. So, as the night returns once more, let us leave the medieval garden, quietly. There is no need for a dramatic ending. The story does not really end. The seasons continue. Plants continue to grow. People continue to plant. Some foods disappear. Others return. New tastes replace old ones. Old tastes sometimes return again. History moves in circles more often than we realize. Imagine the garden centuries from now. Perhaps another person will walk between the plants. Perhaps they will recognize some of our vegetables. Perhaps others will seem strange. Perhaps someone will wonder why people in our time stopped growing a particular crop. They may find our old seed packets, our recipes, our gardening books. They may wonder what our vegetables tasted like, and perhaps they will discover that the foods we considered ordinary were once part of a world that had already disappeared. That is the nature of food. It changes quietly, and yet it connects generations. A seed planted centuries ago and a seed planted today still obey the same ancient instructions. Give me soil. Give me water. Give me light. Give me time. Then I will grow. The medieval gardener knew this. The modern gardener knows it. And anyone who has ever watched a seed become a plant knows it too. The forgotten vegetables are therefore not truly gone. Some are still growing. Some are waiting in gardens. Some are preserved in seeds. Some remain in wild places. Some survive only as names. But their stories remain. Skirret, Good King Henry, Orac, Alexander's, sea kale, rampion, old forms of carrots and beets. Traditional greens, perennial vegetables, wild plants gathered beside streams and woodland paths. They all belong to a larger story. A story about how humans learned to live with plants, how they selected them, moved them, cultivated them, cooked them, forgot them, and sometimes remembered them. The final light of the evening disappears. The village is quiet. The hearth burns softly. Outside, the garden lies beneath the stars. The soil is cool. The leaves move gently in the wind. There is nothing left to do tonight. The plants can rest. The people can rest. And for a little while, so can we. Tomorrow, somewhere, a gardener will open the soil. A small seed will begin another journey. A root will form beneath the earth. A green leaf will unfold toward the morning light. Perhaps it will be a vegetable that millions know. Perhaps it will be one that almost everyone has forgotten. Either way, the cycle continues. And when the morning slowly arrives, the garden will wake once more. Quietly, naturally, as it has done for centuries. And beneath the earth, the forgotten vegetables will remain part of the story, not lost completely, only waiting, waiting in the soil, waiting in memory, waiting for another season, waiting for someone to remember their names.